Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening as well. This is Joseph Trevisani from Worldwide Markets, and thank you for attending this webinar. I hope you find it interesting and instructive and perhaps thought-provoking. I would like to thank, as always, FX Street, Maud and Vicky and Company for making this webinar possible through their success as a Forex portal. I deliberately named the webinar The Near Abroad. The Near Abroad was and I suppose still is, the Russian term, the Soviet term for the old Warsaw Pact states of Eastern Europe. From, what is it that Churchill said, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. That's the Iron Curtain speech. Those countries were in the orbit of the Soviet Union. One might say that they were not there voluntarily, but they lived there for almost 50 years from the end of the Second World War until the fall of the Soviet Union. Those countries have always existed on the marches between the Western countries, now unified in the EU with a tighter unification on the EMU, and the various Russian empires that existed east of them. When we discuss, as we will, by the way, anyone who has any comments, I always say this, who has any comments about anything during the webinar, please don't hesitate to interrupt. Type it into chat, and I'll be glad to stop and answer the question. I always prefer participation to straight lecturing. So please do not hesitate to tell me your comments, and I'll be glad to listen. So these countries have always existed between greater powers. This fact is something which we must keep in mind when we consider the euro, European expansion, the EMU expansion. Now, what do I mean by this? Most of the discussion that one hears about the euro, and I would say the standard economic analyst line now is that the euro will falter in some fashion. It will break up. I don't think many people have that opinion, but it will have to change because it is not a functional entity as it is. Now these opinions, and I've had this opinion myself, although as I'll explain, I am starting to change about this. I did a sort of a Q&A on this on Tuesday actually, on CNBC here in New York, and I was really the only currency person on. I was the only guest on actually, and all of the anchors, we discussed this for about 5 or 6 minutes, and it was very interesting. The standard view, which has been my view as well, is that the euro cannot last in its current form. But the analysis that backs up this logic, and this, what you're looking at here is I think this is I can never remember if it's the Lithuanian or the Latvian currency. But as you can see, it's pegged to the euro. And I'll do the other one so that we can. This is the other one that is pegged to the euro. Okay, so let's put those back. Okay. So the discussion always takes place about the euro along essentially academic lines. You have a monetary union, but you don't have a fiscal union. You have a monetary union, a single interest rate, but you do not have a political union. And this is true. But I've started to realize in doing the research for this webinar that that is not enough of an analysis. It does not take into account the history and the position of the countries from Poland in the north down to Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary in the south that lie between the greater powers. And it does not take into account their view, their own view, of where they fit into the world and how they can best benefit from the things that are going on around them. So to take that into consideration, to put it another way, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the history and the effects that we've seen here on this, the topic in currencies and very much in economics these days. I think it's beneficial to view, and probably accurate, because to view the choices on whether to join the euro or not, or the choice whether to join the euro or not for these countries. And now I'm talking about Estonia. Now, Estonia's already joined, but Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. Let's see if I've forgotten anybody. And the Czech Republic. Now, the other half of the Czech Republic, well, excuse me, for anyone in Eastern Europe, I misspoke. The other half of what used to be Czechoslovakia is now Slovakia, and that is already in the euro. They joined, I believe, in 2011. So these countries, Lithuania and Latvia, Bulgaria, Romania, the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary, are the ones who are making the choices. Their governments, and one would assume their peoples, will make. Now, all of these countries are already members of the EU. But let me talk about the history of that in a second. I'm coming around to the idea that the much greater weight needs to be given, just like in currency trading. You don't only trade the dollar, you trade the dollar against the euro. There are two sides to that balance. You don't just trade the sterling, you trade the sterling against the dollar, or the sterling against the euro, or the Swiss against the euro. There are two sets of considerations involved in making your decision, involved in the market's opinion of what this currency is going to do. And it is the same in the decision, the process, the thoughts, the considerations of the governments and the people involved in these countries and whether to join the euro or not. The choice is not, and the analysis, the question shouldn't be asked, really, or it's not the right question to ask. Is the euro an ideally constructed multi-nation currency? And the answer, of course, is no. Not ideally. But that's not the question that Poland and the Polish people, or the Czechs, or the Romanians, or the Bulgarians are going to ask. The question they're going to ask, and the question their government is going to ask, and hopefully the governments will consult their people, if not by referendum, at least with very extensive public discussions. The question they're going to ask is, what are the alternatives? It's the same question that so many commentators seem to either avoid or forget or give very short shrift to when analyzing the troubles of the countries within the EU right now. And of course, I'm talking about the southern tier: Spain, Italy, Greece, if you will, Cyprus, and Portugal. What alternative, and this is never examined thoroughly, and I've been guilty of this a bit myself. You look at what's happening in the euro, you look at the unemployment in Greece, so we're going to look at some of this. And we'll see some of the advantages of maintaining your own currency. And you say, how can the people put up with this? 27% unemployment rate, a GDP that's been down for 5 years. I mean, how do they put up with this? How does this affect their life? And I think there are two questions about it. One is the unknown, and dropping the euro and crashing off into their own currency again is essentially stepping off into the unknown. And two, the official statistics in most of these countries do not provide an adequate picture of what's actually going on. Probably the unemployment rate officially should probably even be higher than it is in Greece, say, where it's about 27%. But as far as the actual amount of income that any family or anyone else might have, it's probably a good deal lower. There is a much greater ability within these countries and within these cultures, within these economies, and within people to manage than is officially portrayed in the statistics. And I've mentioned this before. I speak to friends of mine in Spain, and I ask them, how is this possible? How can there be 27% unemployment without a revolution? And the answer I always get, or 50% or more unemployment below age 50. And the answer I always get is that the statistics don't cover and can't cover the amount of work and employment that people can find aside from the official statistics, the black market, if you will, the gray market. People have a much greater capacity and ability to cope than are covered in the official statistics. Okay, so that's the background to the sort of the intellectual background to the questions about joining the euro or leaving the euro. It must be considered in, I guess, the logic of the language of logical analysis as a binary. I was talking to Bill O'Leary, our marketing director, when I came in this morning because we shared a ride in, and we were discussing today's webinar, which he has long experience overseas and long experience in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and so we're discussing this. And this is what we're talking about, that this must be seen as a binary choice. It is not enough to analyze the imperfections of the euro or the potential problems for Greece to That's a very good point, Fernando, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. The perception is not of the academic analysis of the success or failure of the euro is not enough. You must address the binary choice. For the Greeks, as bad as things are, there must be a great deal of concern and worry if they would actually try and leave the euro. The opposition party in Greece has not put that forth as a platform, although they have said that if they were in power, they would force renegotiation of the debt deals. Okay, now, from the beginning, membership in the euro, except with two exceptions, officially and by treaty entails joining the EMU, the euro. There were two official opt-outs in the beginning. Britain, because Britain did not want to give up the sterling under Margaret Thatcher, and subsequently too, and Denmark, which, if I'm not mistaken, put the question to a referendum, and the referendum failed. So those two countries, although they're part of the EU, do not have to, they have official opt-outs, they do not have to join the EMU. They don't have to go through the ERM and the entire process of convergence. Everyone else is supposed to join the euro. Now, there hasn't been a official for the remaining countries now that have not joined, the ones that we mentioned earlier. There has never been a hard and fast schedule as to when to join. There was an assumed schedule before the financial crash, and most of it centered on probably around 2015. That is no longer operational, and I don't believe what any anyone who says otherwise, they may be official opinions about this, but the actual schedule for joining is extremely flexible. Not only that, the binary question remains. There are going to be now. And I only talked to Fernando's question here. The origin of the EMU is politics. It's the very awful history of Europe in the Second World War, throughout the 20th century, actually. From First World War to the Second World War to domination of half of the, one might say, imprisonment of half of the continent under the Soviets. The goal, starting in the very early 50s with the Coal and Steel Pact between Germany and France, was to prevent such a thing from happening again. So its origin is politics. It's a form of idealism. You might say it's a form of utopianism, although very weak utopianism. It assumes, and has assumed, that under the changing political systems, and one might say now financial systems as well with the euro, the different peoples and cultures of the continent will join and become closer until they end up in a political union. It appears that cultures, peoples, and languages are far more stubborn than perhaps the idealists imagined. But the ideal, as Fernando says, is still strong. And it is not only as it's sometimes portrayed in people who think that the euro is a bad idea. Remember, we all remember, I don't know how long everyone here has been trading currencies, but I've been doing it professionally since 1988, which means that's 25 years now. And through the late 80s and the 90s, I remember very well excuse me, the dislocations, both economic and financial, caused by 25 different currencies on the continent. I remember one day walking in on a Sunday afternoon to run the Asian shift, and we had an order in Belgian, in the Belgian French cross. There was no liquidity in Asia in this. We held that position of several hundred million, I believe it was Belgian francs, for several hours until we could find enough liquidity to get out of the position. Enormous amount of risk. We ended up making a great deal of money on it. So the dislocations of that kind of system, again, when you think of it as a binary, remember, not only for the people, even the people in Greece or the people in Spain with 25 or more % unemployment, it's still a binary choice. And it's the same on the financial side. It's a binary choice. Yes, the euro may be doing unpleasant things in various countries, and it is. But that doesn't mean that it's still not better than the alternative. And I think that's something that you're seeing in all of the countries under the austerity programs in Europe. As Fernando says, it does not seem, despite what's going on, that the anti-leave the euro idea is gaining much ground. And again, to reiterate, I know I keep harping on this because I think it's accurate, and I think it's a way that the consideration of this entire question needs to change. And I think it's been, and that's why I keep mentioning this, it has been far too much of a linear analysis. It needs to be widened. Political economy is very much a factor here. Okay, so all of the countries in the EU are supposed to join the EMU, the euro, except for Great Britain and Denmark. The question is, of the countries that have joined and the countries that have not joined, which, and this is the topic of the specific topic of the webinar, which ones have fared better under the enormous dislocations of the financial crisis and the subsequent recession? Okay, interesting. Again, I agree, and I disagree. But let me move on a little bit, and then we'll go back and discuss these questions. And I thank all of you for the secret of my longevity in FX trading. That's a personal question. I was an active trader for 15 years, which is about the limit. I actually know people who have been active trading on bank desks for 25 years. I don't know how they do it, frankly. But since 2000, I have been involved on the corporate side, on the retail side. I was one of the founding partners of FX Solutions, and here as well. So my active trading is much more limited than it was now. Primarily, I am an analyst now and not a trader. So that's probably the secret of my longevity. The question. Now let's take a look at. Let's just look at some of the differences in what we have seen over. Let's look at unemployment, because it seems to me that GDP is not a sufficient judge, or this is Greek unemployment, 27%. Okay, this is Spanish unemployment, 27%. This is Portugal unemployment, 17%. Okay, we can look at GDP. This is just to give a balance. Greece has had negative GDP since the middle of 2008. It's a long time. Spain, these are year over year. Zero is right here. About the beginning of 2009, popped up a little bit here, and it's back down. Negative GDP. And Portugal. Similar things in Portugal. The end of 2008, right around the financial crash, came down and back up. No. For Jose, for your question, we do not open accounts in the United States, and in fact, our website is screened and blocked from U.S. IP addresses. Our licensing is in Denmark and in the British Virgin Islands. And because we do not have U.S. licensing, we did not seek U.S. licensing. We do not take accounts from the United States. It's that simple. The U.S. law, part of the Dodd-Frank bill, is that only U.S. registered FCMs, FDMs, can market and take United States clients. So that was our choice not to do that. However, we operate everywhere else in the world. Okay, now, so we saw the unemployment rate. So let's look at some of the unemployment rates just as a comparison in these countries in what used to be called Mittel Europa, Middle Europe. 11% in Hungary. Poland, 14%. Bulgaria, 11.8%. Romania, 6.7%. I can't verify that. I can't verify any of these. These charts are all from Bloomberg. This is what Bloomberg has for official Romanian unemployment rate. I would count myself dubious on that. The Czech Republic, 8%. Lithuania, 13%. Latvia, 10%. Okay, what is uniform about all of those rates? They're lower. They are lower than the European countries that I spoke about. What is also true about all of these countries, they all have separate, let's just put up and I deliberately chose the countries in Northern Europe that are underneath the austerity programs because that's the comparison we're trying to make. Would a country be better off with its own currency. Okay, let's look at Romanian GDP, just as an example. Looking just at the unemployment rates, one would have to say yes, and there's a good reason for this. What the euro does, what it forces a country to do, there are two kinds of devaluations as a term that can be discussed. One's a currency devaluation. So if you are in Germany and you want to go to a beach and stay at Piraeus or in one of the Greek islands, and there's a drachma, and Greece have had lots of problems and they have big deficits, their economy is not performing well, what can you be sure is going to happen? The drachma is going to drop in value against the euro or the mark. And so for a German or a Brit or an American, as the drachma weakens, it becomes much more cost-effective to vacation in Greece. That's the typical, standard, historical way of adjustment. And the Greeks and many other countries, the Italians, serial devaluations throughout much of the post-war world, much of the post-war economic history. Now, when you have the same currency, it doesn't get rid of devaluation, but it changes it. The devaluation cannot take place externally. A euro is supposed to be the same value in Munich as it is in Athens or in Barcelona. Or excuse me for my friends in Barcelona. I am working on that still. But where does the devaluation take place? The devaluation takes place in the expense of the goods produced in the country, and tourism can be seen as a good. What happens? Well, the greatest cost, the greatest component of any good, tourism, hotels, wine, whatever is produced in the country, cars, the greatest component is always the cost of labor. So if Greece is producing cars, just as an idea, Greece is producing cars and Germany is producing cars, and they start out the same. What will have to happen in order for the Greeks to sell their cars? The price is going to have to drop. But if the price can't drop because the drachma is cheaper, and so vis-a-vis an external currency, the price of the car is cheaper, then the actual price of the car has to drop in euros. And the way to do that, the way that happens, is that salaries will be hit, because then the labor cost component of producing that car is reduced. And so the price of the car in a stable euro drops. So this is internal devaluation. And that is why the rates, the unemployment rates, are so different. That's one of the reasons anyway. Hungarian unemployment, again, 11.6. Spain, 27%. Romania. Okay, Romania, let's not use Romania because I, for one, do not really believe that 6.7 unemployment rate. Lithuania, 13%. So we can see immediately the difference between, and it's the same thing with GDP. Bulgarian GDP, still positive. Not by much, but still positive. Czech GDP, a little bit negative here, down in 2012, but again, a much better run than we have seen. Look at Latvia. Latvia and Lithuania are probably the best performers in the EU since the financial crash. Look at this, 5.1%. Now, yes, they had an almost 17% crash in 2008, but the averages since then have been strong. Let's take a look at Lithuania as well. Similar type of performance. Now, when judging, and this is why I mentioned the sort of the political economy of this earlier. You know what, let me look at the comments first here to make sure I can, since I encourage people to ask questions, I would like to answer them. Yes, I understand what you're saying. I believe that the euro will have to change, but I am not as convinced as I was. Because, again, we are faced with the binary choice. How? In order for to say, develop a two-tier euro system, whatever that means, somebody has to do the planning, someone has to make the conception work. You would have to have the very people, the European bureaucrats, the European central bankers, construct this. And I don't see any chance of that happening. It's certainly not going to be the politicians in the countries that are under austerity right now and have taken bailouts. They're going to construct a two-tier system. So again, although the analysis just on one side can lead you to that direction, you come up immediately against the difficult impracticality. What is it going to be? Who is going to design it? How is it going to work? So that's the same problem with the idea that the euro should or inevitably will break up. Now, what you're saying is true, that the euro is absolutely a forced system. The majority of the people were not consulted, meaning there was no referendum, not in all the countries, but in most of the countries, there was no referendum. Yes, in a representative system, and they all have a representative system in some fashion, you vote for the party and the politician, and their stance on this is, in effect, your participation in this question. But it has always been taken amongst the European bureaucrats, the European planners, the European politicians, that this is a worthy and an inevitable goal. Carlos, you're absolutely correct on that too. The Spanish unemployment, let's take a look. I don't know how far back I went on this chart, but this is also true, and this is my point earlier. Let's take a look at Spanish unemployment. You're right. Now, Spanish unemployment and European unemployment in general has always been much higher than U.S. unemployment. So yes, if it is 27% now, that's probably double what it was in the 90s. So nevertheless, it is a much higher rate. Now, yes, is that a structural problem? I say without doubt it's a structural problem. All of the European countries pretty much have high structural unemployment. The reasons for that have to do with labor laws and many other things which are kind of beyond the topic of today's discussion. But yes, there's a structural unemployment factor there, which has been made worse by the performance of the economy. They've also had a much lower GDP growth rate over the past generation than the United States and other countries. Again, that's a structural issue. There's no doubt about that. Okay, so let's move on a little bit to the specifics about the countries that are considering the euro. Now, all of these countries here, now, I showed you this earlier, I'll show you again. These countries are sent, this is Latvia. No, that was Lithuania, and this is Latvia. Okay? Their currencies are fixed to the euro. They are essentially in the euro already. You take a look at the chart, you can see where we are. There have been some fluctuations overnight, but by and large, they have fixed their currency. They are participating in the convergence requirements and have essentially satisfied them. I think one of them is actually, I can't remember which one, I think it's Latvia is scheduled to be approved, I think this June, or at least the decision is going to come down in June, and they will undoubtedly join the euro. Both of these countries will join the euro. The interesting thing about these two countries, Latvia and Lithuania, is that their GDP is very, very different despite essentially being in the euro. The reasons for that are, I want to put this in the correct fashion. Both of these countries are very small, maybe 2 or 3 million people. They also have a history, as one might expect, of being dominated by much larger political players surrounding them. There was a time in the Middle Ages where there was a Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which incorporated much of Poland, but certainly in modern historical times, they've been dominated by the Soviet Union. So they have both the political motivation to be part of the Western Bloc led by Germany and France. And that motivation has made their adjustments of the structural things that we were talking about. Now, they never had, these being largely free for 20 years, a little bit more, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were free in that time to construct their own political and economic system. So they do not have the legacies in those countries of the high-cost social systems that are extant in much of the rest of Europe. So it was a lot easier for them. After all, I mean, the Soviet Union fell apart barely 20 years ago. 1991, 22 years ago. Is that right? Yes, 22 years ago. So they never had many of the structural accretions that have inhibited economic growth and promoted unemployment in some of the other countries in Europe. I believe also they have a much higher birth rate, and they're much younger. I did not check that, but I believe that they are much younger as nations with the average age, and that also makes for a more flexible economic system. And you can see the results in Latvia and Lithuania. And for these two countries, when you combine their economic performance, their lack of structural or relative lack of structural changes, many of them were made already. I believe these countries have flat taxes. Their governments have been very pro-growth. And the fact that they have achieved this underneath what's essentially the euro, the fixed exchange rate for both the Latvian and Lithuanian countries. There's no reason. And you combine that with the insurance and, if you will, political protection that being a member of the Western Alliance, the Western European Economic and Political Alliance in the EU and the EMU brings. Both countries, I think both politically, meaning the political leaders of the country and the people in the country, are in favor of joining officially the euro. And frankly, I can't see any reason why there wouldn't be. These charts speak for themselves. Okay, now let us look at some of the other countries and some of the choices that they're going to have to make. Let's start with, I think, the 6th largest economy in the EU, and that's Poland. Okay, this is annual growth rate quarterly. That is a much better chart than anything out of, if you will, old Europe. So it would seem to be here that the benefits of being outside the euro speak for themselves. And so that's Poland. Let's look at Polish unemployment. Again, I can't, 14%. I don't have this chart going back far enough to know what the typical employment was. But remember, if you go back very far in Eastern Europe, you have a very different situation because you are talking about economies that were moribund underneath Soviet domination. They did not participate. Their infrastructure was decrepit. They were not part of the Western trading system by and large. So having higher unemployment from, say, 1990 to 2000 doesn't really tell you anything about the Polish economy vis-a-vis the euro and the European Union. It tells you much more about the decrepitude of the economy and the economic system under the Soviets in Eastern Europe. So that analysis is not necessary. When Carlos mentioned that the Spanish have always had high employment rate, that translates into a structural analysis and a structural reason having to do with the Spanish economy. I agree with that. But that is not true of the Eastern European countries, where the higher unemployment rate has to do with the collapse of the previous economic system and the building of a new one. It's not necessarily structural in that sense. Okay, so we look at Poland. We look at Hungary. GDP. Not doing nearly as well as Poland. Let's look at Bulgaria. Again, not doing nearly as well, sort of between the two. Romania. Depending on how accurate these figures are, the only reason I say that is because, as I said, I have my doubts about their unemployment figures. Okay, come on. Hold on. These light mice are great. Czechoslovakia. Nope, not Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic. And then Lithuania and Latvia, which we spoke about. Okay, let's look at Poland. So, now remember, taking this as a binary decision, the political side and then the economic performance side. And that itself is a binary decision because it is twofold. For countries within the euro, Greece, for example, Spain, for example, the political decision is already made. A member of the EU, member of the EMU. The binary decision relates to whether or not to leave and what would be the cost. And it seems to me that right now the cost far outweighs still, though not as much as it did before, the benefit of leaving. That calculus could change. The longer it goes on, the more likely that a political force or a political movement or a political leader comes to power in Greece or some of the other countries where the position is an abrogation of the austerity budgets and the austerity agreements with the lenders. However, if they do that, they're again faced with the negative choice of what to do. Now, when you look at Poland, let's take it in two different ways. Poland is a much larger country. It's a much more well-known, historic country that has had a long history and an independent history for many years as well, certainly from the late Middle Ages up into the beginning of the Enlightenment. Poland was an independent and powerful country. So it's political, and it was independent, of course, between the wars, First and Second World War as well. And it was actually an independent country under the Soviets too, except it wasn't very independent. But it was an independent entity. There was a time for maybe 100 years where actually there was no Polish political entity. I know that some of my mother's people came from a place called Russian Poland. What does that mean? It was the part of Poland that was taken by the Tsars as the Polish state withered and lost power. So Poland probably, on the political side, has both less need to seek protection or seek alignment with the West, at least in an official political sense, and probably also a little bit less desire to as well, since they have a long historical independent nation. That remains, of course, the economic and financial choice. Will the euro be a benefit? The assumption was, going into the EMU, in the lead up to the EMU in 99 and 2001, that the euro would be a benefit for everybody. That has clearly not proven to be the case. Greece, and probably Spain, and maybe Italy, and probably Portugal, would be much better off now had they not joined the euro. But that is now old history. I'm sure that one of the reasons that the European authorities, ECB and otherwise, and political authorities, ignored some of the rather dubious things that the Greek governments did to meet the convergence criteria was because they were operating under that assumption. They, again, had the choice. How can we sell the euro? How can we believe in the euro ourselves if Greece can't join, if we keep Greece out? So they let Greece in. They shouldn't have. But they did, by the logical standards of what was necessary. It's also true that the idea that an economy not nearly as developed as Germany or France can yoke itself successfully to the monetary policy of that nation is a fallacy, as we have seen. But it doesn't mean that the binary choice now of whether to leave or stay falls on the leave side. It probably still falls on the staying side. That's true for countries within the euro, even one as damaged as Greece. But it is not true for Poland. Poland's political system, Poland's politicians, and there's an interesting split in Poland. The population in Poland is very much against joining the euro. The current political leaders, I think it's Donald Tusk, and I forget the finance minister's name, are in favor of joining the euro at some point. Poland also has a further obstacle in that you have to change the Polish constitution to, and I'm not sure of the process of changing the Polish constitution, to permit them to join. So for Poland, and Donald Tusk has mentioned recently, I think it's Donald, it is Tusk though, that to consider this, he was talking, I believe, recently about a referendum. And I think one of the things that I think is going to be a definite result of the blow-up in the euro and everything that has happened over the past 5 years is that any European leader, any European political party will and must win over the population to get them to join the euro. I don't think anyone, any government, is going to try to just put the euro through, even if they're elected, without putting it in a very substantial form to approval by the population. So that is one result of all of this that I think will definitely be true. Now, if you look at Poland's performance since the financial crisis, it's hard to come up with a logical reason. Again, who benefits? What would be the benefit? We can sit here and think about it now. What would be the benefit to Poland of joining the euro? I don't know what it would be right now. They would actually have access to ECB liquidity? Yes, that's true. But if they need it, that means they're in trouble. They will get rid of exchange rate volatility. Yes, that's true. But let's look at the dollar. Okay? This is the dollar against the Polish zloty. What happened after the financial crisis? Actually, just before the financial crisis. The zloty devalued a lot. Over here, the early part of 2000, it was about 2 zloty to the dollar, a little bit more. Where'd it go to? Where are we here? We're almost 4. Not quite, 3.75. It almost doubled. Or, from the zloty point of view, halved. So, the adjustment was external. And for the people within the country, this is what you want. So it's going to be very difficult to make a cogent argument that if Poland had been a member of the ERM in 2008, that this couldn't have happened. Well, if that couldn't have happened, you know what? This wouldn't have happened either. Poland never actually went negative as far as GDP goes. The only other country I think that can say that in Europe is Germany. And it is, and would be, you can take a look at the euro. The same thing happened to the zloty against the euro. Here we are. From maybe 3.3 up to almost 5 in that same period that it was falling against the dollar. So that was absorbing, that was taking a large part of the devaluation. And there is no question that this helped the Polish economy. Let's take a look at the Bulgarian. This is, again, same thing here. Now, Bulgaria's economy has not performed nearly as well. But look at the same thing. The currency. Here we go. 1.25 less up to 1.6 up to here. Now, the reason that here's against the leu in Romania. This is the Czech krona. I mean, we're looking at the same chart here. So there is no doubt that and here we're back at the Lithuanian currency. Come on, computer. There we go. Okay, that one's fixed, so we don't need to look at that one. So we can see there's no doubt that the currency aided the countries. Now, I will also say that the performance of various of these countries is not nearly as good as the Polish performance as far as economic performance goes, except in Czechoslovakia. I'm sorry, I grew up with Czechoslovakia, not the Czech Republic and Slovakia, so that's what trips off my tongue immediately. Now, so we have to ask another question. And this goes to who is both able and willing, or willing and able to join the euro. This is the Bulgarian GDP. In the farther Eastern European countries, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, those countries are smaller than Poland. They have far less of a stable history. Their institutions, both legal and political, are less developed. And so they are much farther behind, or the actual state of economic and political development than the Czech Republic and then Poland. And also, I would say, Lithuania and Latvia as well. So the differences there, even though their currencies adjusted, had to do as much with the structural condition of the country and its economy as it did with the currency adjustment and their position vis-a-vis the euro. Just let me ask one question. I haven't seen anything from our FX Street members here, so let me just ask what the time frame is on this. Usually they are in here telling me that it's time to go before this. So let me just check. So again, we have a difference, I think, in both ability and need on the various countries. The question about who and when will join the euro is not a uniform question. For countries like Lithuania and Latvia, who are essentially in the euro anyway, I know that's an old joke about lifting the. I tell you, one question I think I'd like to do, or one topic I'd like to do sometime in the future is an analysis of the of demographics and their effect on political economy. But that's another question. So the question of who's going to join the euro is very much a nation-by-nation country. For Latvia and Lithuania, also I forgot to mention, the Czech Republic, both the government, originally under Václav Havel, and now, I forget the man's name, and the population are against joining the euro. So it's unlikely that Poland is going to join anytime soon. I mean, the Czech Republic is going to join anytime soon. For Poland, again, I would say that's pretty much the same question as well, although the government recently has been making some noises about getting on track for joining the euro. I think that's probably more a trial balloon, if you will, than anything else. So for Lithuania and Latvia, the logic, both political and economic, is there for joining the euro. And since they're essentially in it anyway, I'm sure they will join. For Poland and Czech Republic, whose economies are advanced enough and political and economic systems are advanced enough to join if they wanted to, it seems likely that they won't. And one of the reasons has been the advantage that they have had over the past 5 years by having an independent currency that permitted it to absorb some of the adjustments necessary. For the remaining countries, for Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary, I would say that a project for joining the euro is much farther off, both for politics. Their political systems don't meet the standards of what the Europeans want, and also for economics, that even though they've had an adjusting currency, they have not been able to provide, to translate that into a successful economy. Okay, folks, I will wrap up here. We actually got through most of my topics today. I thank you very much for attending. I hope it was useful. We are putting on another webinar next week with FX Street about volatility. I will tell you some stories and also some different types of volatility and how it, I think, works for trading. Again, thank everyone for coming, and I thank Maud and Vicky and all of the other people at FX Street for helping us put this on. Take care, and thank you all for coming again.